budget and so forth. The intention of the arms corps baseline documents, they are more technical documents where we have standards which dictate what has to be completed and what has to be done during each of these phases of this risk reduction process before we are allowed to continue into a next phase. So we would start with establishing a number of baselines, and the entire approach from arms corps is to do baseline management. We would start off with the requirements baseline, and this is at the point where the requirement is formally moves into the arms corps domain to verify whether that requirement is sufficient, whether all the information is contained in the requirements which we have received, and this happens during the concept phase. We would then move on to the functional baseline, where the selected option has been determined, and typically the A specifications, which are very high-level system specifications, would be finalized. And as we move through the process, we would need to establish baselines: allocated baseline, product baseline, manufacturing baseline, interim operating baseline, and the final operating baseline as we move through these phases. And the intention of establishing these baselines is to ensure that everything that needs to be addressed and completed during any specific phase is sufficiently done. And those baselines are typically then also audited by the Quality Assurance Department of Arms Corps to ensure that everything has been done. And this is to ensure that as we continue through this risk reduction process, that we address issues at the correct time. We do not come to the point where we have industrialized something and then we remember that we've forgotten how we're going to maintain it. Just as an example.
Mr. Chris, I apologize to interrupt you, but just so we don't lose you, could you, as you work through the different baselines, can you remind us what the acronyms stand for, and slowly, so that we can make notes for ourselves? Thank you.
And can I continue to the next 2 slides further, because they are actually better illustrated. If you would allow me, Commissioner, to just continue, I will get back to that slide. I think 2 slides from here. Just continuing with the standard practices and policies within arms corps. APROC 097, which applied at the time of the STPPs, is the standard practice for selection of contractual sources. What this practice does, it details the process to be followed, which would result in best meeting arms corps' need as described in the relevant request for proposal, and ensure that the source selection process for the impartial, equitable and comprehensive evaluation of each offerer's proposal and minimize the cost of the selection process. This practice contains, amongst others, the roles and responsibilities of evaluators and process assurers, guidelines with respect to the determination and evaluation criteria, and generation of an RFO subsequent to evaluation of the received offers. So, in other words, what this practice describes is it provides guidelines on how a request for offer should be compiled. It describes how a value system should be compiled, how the 2 different categories of criteria should be determined. It describes the process of evaluation of the received offers against those criteria, what should be taken into consideration, for example, how risk should be factored into the evaluation. And it also then describes the roles of the different parties, the roles of the IPT, Integrated Project Team, the role of the process assurer, and also the role of the independent consolidator. And this is all to ensure, firstly, that the value system is properly and sufficiently comprehensively developed to properly evaluate the offers, and to ensure that once those offers have been evaluated, that it is a true reflection of the requirements of the user as stated in the user requirement statement. It also then details the process and allocates responsibilities to the different parties to ensure impartiality as far as the evaluation is concerned. KB 1000 is the arms corps.
Apologies, Mr. Chris. For the record, Commissioners, the policy Mr. Crystal has just referred to item 6 and result 2, pages 185 to 214.
Thank you.
It's page 185 to up to page 214 of result 2. Thank you, Mr. President.
KB 1000 is the OMSCO policy, or was the OMSCO policy for acquisition and weapon system management support, and it was dated 1st of May 1995. It's subsequently been superseded by APOL 1000, where VB 1000 very comprehensively describes the different baselines, the milestone documents, the different phases of the process. The KB 1000 document focuses more on the OMSCO part of it, on the baselines which need to be established. It addresses baseline management, and the important thing is that it is completely aligned with the VB 1000, because those documents are actually addressing the same process and the same baselines. So it goes further than VB 1000 because it's an OMSCO specific document, and it also describes the composition of baseline review boards, these being the boards which would approve the baselines at level 5 in the OMSCO process and would allow the OMSCO project team to continue or to proceed from one phase to the next phase after the baseline has been approved. And this is the slide which I would like to use to illustrate the interrelationship between the level 5 and 6 processes. I think that the level 6 process has been described in great detail by a previous presenter, starting with the ROC, which is the required operational capability, proceeding to a staff target, which is the ST. SR is the staff requirement, and the staff requirement would then also contain the URS, basically two URSs, the FIRS and the LIRS, the functional user requirement statement and the logistics user requirement statement. Then after the project study has been completed, the project study report, PSR, it's a project study report. Then the development plan, DP, the acquisition plan, AP, and the eventual closure report. Those are the milestone documents at level 6. Level 5, baseline documents, which are OMSCO documents, generated by OMSCO and also approved by baseline review boards, which are purely OMSCO bodies. RBL is the requirements baseline, which is the first baseline to be established after we have received the requirement from the DoD, and this is where the program enters into the OMSCO domain. Then the FBL would be the functional baseline, and this would be the baseline which would contain the high-level specifications, like the A specification, which basically just describes at a high level what the chosen system or product system's performance should be. Then as we progress through the definition phase, where this selected option is properly defined, the allocated baseline is intended to contain more detailed specifications in terms of the systems engineering process, typically B and C specifications, which are specifications which are sufficiently detailed to allow us to enter into a contract with industry to develop a product or a product system meeting those detailed specifications. So that would be the allocated baseline. Once the design development process has been completed, we would then enter into the industrialization phase, but the product baseline, PBL, has to be established, and the PBL would then indicate all the detailed specifications, amongst others, of the system, because at the end of the PBL, we would then also have the final development models which fit form and function, meet the user requirements, which can also meet the environmental requirements, although they are still manufactured in a laboratory environment. We then go through the industrialization phase, where those selected models or developed models are then industrialized to allow us to enter into production. It's also during this phase where all the test equipment would be developed and a manufacturing baseline is then established. The manufacturing baseline's intention is to indicate that this system is now sufficiently mature to enter into production. We would then go through the production phase. Here at the end, before it's commissioned, an interim operating baseline, and this is where the logistics plans would then be evaluated to ensure that the system is sufficiently maintainable by means of operational test and evaluation. And once that has been completed and the system has been in use, typically for 2 to 3 years, a final operating baseline would be established, and that's the point where the Defence Materiel Division would hand over to the respective arms of service.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Commissioners, may I tender my apologies? I confused the commissioners. The KB 1000 to which the witness is speaking to is actually from pages 91 of Crystal 2. Kindly make a correction on the notes you have made for the source. I apologize for the error. 91 of Crystal 2. And that will be 91 to 103. Having made that correction, Mr. Crystal, please refer to page 97 of Crystal 2. And that should, the numbering is correct in the KB 1000.
Can you just repeat what do I need to confirm?
I wanted to make sure you've located the page.
Yes, I have.
What is set out in paragraph 6.3 of that document at page 97, does that accord with what you have described in this slide 14?
Exactly, ma'am, except that in my slide, the very first baseline is referred to as the requirements baseline. In DB 1000, they refer to it as a requirements statement baseline, or SBL. It's the same thing.
Thank you for pointing that out to us. You speak of the various baselines. Is it fair to conclude that as they appear on the slide, it's the order in which the baselines are reached?
Yes, that is true.
Now, to clarify issues for us, are these baselines, are they documents? What are they? And how does one determine whether or not all the baselines have been satisfied in respect of each project?
Yes, Commissioner, the baselines are established by means of formal baseline documentation. There's a military standard, RXA Military Standard 3, which describes what each baseline entails, what has to be presented for establishment of each of those baselines. So the baselines are established by means of formal baseline documentation, which is submitted to a baseline review board. And the baseline review board is a formally constituted arms body who then reviews the baseline and then approves the baseline. And only once the baseline has been approved can we then proceed to the next phase of the process.
From what you've just said, can we conclude that absent approval by the baseline review board, the project is not able to proceed? I will rephrase that. Understood. Is it imperative that the baseline review board approve each baseline in order for the project to proceed to the next level?
Yes, Commissioner, in terms of the ARMSCO policy, where ARMSCO follows a baseline management process, we have to all baselines, as indicated there, have to be approved before, from an ONSCO point of view, we are entitled to proceed from one phase to the next phase. That's true.
Thank you, Mr. Crystal. You may continue with your...
So before we continue, I was looking on the baselines. I see here, I'm not quite sure what does RBL, RBL, and ABL mean.
Mr. Crystal, if you could just take us through the various baselines and particularly what each acronym stands for, and take us a bit slowly through that, would appreciate.
Commissioner, if I may start with the first one down there, the RBL. In DB1000, still it is referred to as the RSBL, Requirements Statement Baseline, or we call it the Requirements Baseline. It's the same thing. This is where the ONSCO process is initiated. So that baseline we establish, indicating that the requirement is comprehensive enough for us to proceed into the systems engineering process. In other words, that sufficient information is contained in the requirement that we have received. If not, we would then refer back to the DOD or to the SADF and request additional information for clarity. This would be part of the concept phase. And just to remind the Commission that the concept phase is once a required operational capability has been stated in operational terms. In other words, this is the user stating that I want something that can do the following for me without specifying what this thing has to look like, but requiring a capability only. We would then go into a concept phase where different options are developed which could potentially meet that capability requirement. Those options are then weighed up against each other, evaluated, and a best option is then selected. That is at the end of the concept phase. These are where the different concepts are evaluated and the best concept is selected. And the next baseline would be the functional baseline, FBL, where the selected concept would then be identified and a high-level specification, typically an A specification for that selected concept, would then be developed. So at the end of this phase, when the functional baseline has been established, we know what it is that we are going to continue with. In other words, the user might have indicated that they need something that can deliver a certain amount of explosives over a certain distance. The different options would have been an artillery gun, an aircraft dropping a bomb, a missile system. We have now narrowed that down to an aircraft dropping a bomb. So now we have a high-level specification of that aircraft. During this definition phase, we would then further define exactly what this selection option should look like. At the end of this phase, we would then establish the allocated baseline. That is what ABL stands for. The allocated baseline would contain sufficient information in terms of specifications to allow us to contract industry to do a development for us of that system. So it's sufficiently detailed now to enter into a development program. So in the ABL, we would then have B specifications, which are much more detailed specifications. Then we would proceed through the design development phase, where we would typically contract industry to do the design development for us. And at the end of the development phase, this is where they stop in the laboratory, where we would typically have an engineering development model, which is a product which looks like the final product and also meets the environmental requirements of the final product, but has not been industrialized. And so the PBL stands for Product Baseline, which contains all that information that comes from the development process. We would then enter into an industrialization phase once the PBL has been formally approved. And once the industrialization of this product system has been completed, we would then establish a manufacturing baseline. So all the manufacturing data banks would now be complete at the establishment of that baseline. And we can then go into series production with the system. And at the end of the evaluation by the user and all the logistics elements have been finalized. We would establish an OBL, which is an operating baseline. That operating baseline would allow the project to be handed over from the project's environment into the user environment. So now everything is there, the product system is there, the logistics are there, the training is there, the facilities are there, everything is there.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. May I continue?
Commissioner, I'm still with the OMSCOR policies and practices. The next policy is KP 019 that was applicable at the time of the STPs, and this.
Commissioners, if I may point out, this particular policy is currently not part of your bundle, but it shall after lunch be included in CRISL 2, and I will point out at what page it is to be found. Thank you.
KP 019 at the time of the STPs superseded now called A Standard A Corp 001, contains all the delegations. OMSCOR's Board of Directors, being the highest authority in OMSCOR, has all the powers to approve anything. And they delegate certain powers to subservient bodies and personnel or functionaries within the organization. So the KP 019 contains all the delegations from the OMSCOR board into the organization itself. It contains different sections. The first section being the delegations with respect to acquisition functions. And that section of KP 019 would indicate who has the authority to approve contracts up to certain values, depending on which value. There are two subservient authorization bodies to the OMSCOR board itself. So these delegations would then indicate what powers those authorization bodies have to approve contracts, to amend contracts, and also to extend contracts when necessary. There are other sections in this document which is more internal sections. Those would indicate who has the powers to sign certain documents, sign certain expenditures, and sign leave forms and things like that. But the important part, as far as this is concerned, are the delegations with regards to acquisition matters.
Does seem that KP 019 is in this file at page 134.
Chair, what Advocate Solomon is pointing out to me is it would appear that KP 019 is in the bundle at page
134 up to 180.
At page 134, that is correct. Chair, what we will do is to attend to the index itself to make sure that the documents are properly described and can be easily located in the bundle. One of CRISL 2. I'm indebted to Advocate Solomon. Mr. Christel, if you could continue.
Commissioner, the last slide in this section relating to policies is VB 1000, although it's a joint DoD OMSCOR document. I think VB 1000 was dealt with at length by one of the previous presenters. VB 1000 is the general policy for the management of Category 1 material, acquisition process, and this describes the approach to be followed by members of the defence family in the acquisition of weapon systems. It contains, amongst others, the mandates and roles of OMSCOR, and in the VB 1000 document still the SADF, which has now become the SANDF, and the Department of Defence in the acquisition process. And this is the policy to be applied with regard to the management of the acquisition process of armaments, Category 1 materials through all the phases of the process. And the previous slide, which I showed, indicating the milestones at level 6, DoD milestones, and baselines at level 5, which are OMSCOR baselines, are all described in BB 1000. Can I continue? And then I'm going to look at the SDPPs now that we have looked at the policies and practices, standard policies and practices within OMSCOR. If we look specifically at the Special Defence Package programs, where were there deviations from those standard policies and practices? And firstly, APROC 097, which is the practice relating to the selection of contractual sources. That is the practice which details provides guidance with regards to the development of value systems, who is responsible for what in this process of developing value systems, developing RFOs, approving the RFOs, doing the evaluation, approving the evaluation reports. The guidelines of APROC 097 in terms of what a value system should look like, what the criteria should look like. Those were followed in the SDPP process, but there was a deviation in respect of the responsibilities of OMSCOR program manager and the project teams, as detailed in the document, in the sense that the practice dictates that the process should be led by OMSCOR and only provides for participation by the DoD on evaluation panels. It does not allocate any approval responsibility as far as value systems or RFOs are concerned to the DoD, because this is strictly an internal OMSCOR process. It provides for participation by DoD because DoD members on the criteria development panels and on the evaluation panels actually bring the user's perspective into the development of those criteria. In the SDPP process, some of the value systems, and this will be dealt with in greater detail by the respective program managers who will present after me. Some of the value systems and evaluation reports were finally approved and signed off by the Department of Defense and not by OMSCOR. So this is a deviation from the standard OMSCOR process.
In regard to the projects, the SDPP projects, are you able to point out which projects had their value systems and evaluation reports approved and signed off by the DoD and which were approved and signed off by OMSCOR? In a position to point that out?
Commissioner, I'm not in a position to give you a definitive answer. I know that the submarine and corvette programs, value systems and evaluation reports were signed off by the DoD and not by OMSCOR. I unfortunately cannot vouch for the others.
Thank you. As you pointed out, we will take it up with the respective teams. You may continue.
As far as the delegations are concerned, KP019, in terms of the OMSCOR delegations in the section relating to acquisition matters.
Just before we pass this point, are you in a position to give us any reason, how or why this very system and evaluation reports were signed by officials of the DoD instead of signed by OMSCOR officials?
No, I'm not in a position to give you a reason for that. There's no, as far as my knowledge goes, approved document from a higher authority indicating that this would relieve OMSCOR from that process, so that it should now be done by the DoD. And I think this is also why there's no consistency. Some of these were signed off by OMSCOR, some were not.
What we now call deviations, in terms of what we have in front of us, these were actually directives that were issued that differed from standard policies.
No, Commissioner, there was a directive, I will get to that directive later on, which amended some of the standard processes in terms of evaluation, but it did not necessarily amend all the arms corps or relevant arms corps policies and practices that applied during the time of the STPPs. So these were delegations, and this is one of them, which is deviations. This is one deviation which did exist from the arms corps policy, where arms corps board would be responsible to approve preferred bidders and would also be responsible to finally approve contracts on the preferred bidder. In the case of the STPPs, it did not happen. The preferred bidders were approved outside of the arms corps domain, and the final contracts were also approved outside of the arms corps.
What I'm trying to get at, for instance, on this APROC 097, it states what practices for selection of contractual sources. But then you see in bullet point 2 that in respect of the SDPP, that has to be before, isn't it? What appears above is practice, the arms for practice, but that bullet point 2 shows that this was a deviation from the standard practice.
That is correct, Chair. What the first bullet indicates is what it should be, and the second bullet indicates why there's a deviation. The first bullet indicates that sorry.
I was going to say now who brought in the deviation, how was it brought about the deviation? Was there a directive, what happened?
Not to my knowledge, Chair. I have not been able to find any directive or this document indicating that there should be this deviation.
So, the last one from me. Did I understand it was saying that the normal practice is that the preferred bidders should or answer the one who picks up the preferred bidders? That is the normal procedure.
That is correct.
And did I understand it was saying that in the case of the SDPPs, that was not the case?
That is correct.
Do you know the reason why?
Chair, I will deal with that specific deviation and the approval process at length later in my presentation as to exactly how the preferred bidders, what process was followed, and also what process was followed with the final contracting or approval for contracting. I have 2 complete sections dealing with that. But as I've indicated, except for a ministerial directive, which I will address, indicating that the evaluation should happen at different levels, which is outside of the normal arms corps processes, that would constitute an authority to do it in that manner. It does not necessarily address which body has to approve the preferred bidders and which body has to approve the final contracts.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll continue.
Okay. The next deviation relates to VB 1000. Firstly, this is not necessarily a deviation.
I apologize. According to my copy, you appear to have skipped a slide. Alvin, it's supposed to be on slide 19.
Oh, I have actually addressed the deviations, but in terms of KP 019, the Arms Corps Board of Directors, being the tender board, has the sole authority that can authorize preferred bidders and also authorize contracts to be placed on the identified preferred bidders. In the case of the STPPs, As I indicated now, I will deal with that in much greater detail, but there was a deviation in the sense that the preferred bidders were recommended into DoD forums, being the AASB, the AAC, and a ministers' committee, and eventually authorized by cabinet and not by the Arms Corps board. And the subsequent contract placement was also not authorized by the Arms Corps board, but by cabinet. And cabinet authorized those contracts post negotiations by a negotiating team which had been appointed by cabinet, and I will get to that. I will address that issue as well. Is that okay?
Thank you.
In terms of VB 1000, which is the general policy for the management of Category 1 material acquisition, this is not really a deviation, but at the time of the STPPs, VB 1000 being a document which dates back to 1992, does not necessarily reflect the structures or the approval bodies which existed within the DoD at the time. It still reflected the structures which existed at the time prior to the Secretariat for Defence and the Defence Acquisition Department coming into being. So, whereas the bodies that authorized the different milestone documents were the AACB, AASB, and AAC, which were bodies which were created post the approval of the MODAC 1 document, which I believe has also been addressed. The VB 1000 structure still addresses the previous authorization bodies being, and these are Afrikaans acronyms, PKK for Projekkoördineringskomitee, Project Coordinating Committee, which would be the equivalent of the AACB, but which would be chaired, where the AACB is chaired by the Chief of Defence Material. This body would have been chaired by the Chief of Logistics. Then there was the VBR, Verdedigings Bevelsraad, Defence Command Board, which would have been chaired by the Chief of the SADF, where in the current structure that would be equivalent to the AASB, which is chaired by the Secretary for Defence, and then the Verdedigingsbeplanningskomitee, which is the Defence Planning Committee, chaired by the Minister of Defence, which is equivalent to the current AAC, Arms Acquisition Council, which is also chaired by the Minister. In terms of the VB 1000, and as I indicated earlier on, the VB 1000 does stipulate certain non-negotiable milestone documents, which in terms of the Arms Corps process is important for us, but is not a mandatory document before Arms Corps can continue. In the VB 1000, it indicates that the two non-negotiable milestones are the staff target and acquisition plan. When we executed the STPs, at the time of contracting, approved acquisition plans did not exist for all of the programs.
Do you know when the acquisition plans for each program, for each program were approved?
I cannot say offhand, Commissioner, but those dates are available. I just do not have them at the moment. But it was post the actual approval of the contracts in most of the cases.
So is that is post?
I cannot say in all the cases, but in most of the cases, the acquisition plans were approved post contracting.
Thank you.
The mandatory acquisition plan in the SANDF or DoD environment did not necessarily constitute a hold point from a policy perspective, which prevented Arms Corps to authorize a contract. And as I have previously indicated, the importance of the acquisition plan to Arms Corps is that Arms Corps cannot proceed to authorize a contract and place a contract on industry if we do not have an approved financial authority from the DoD. In order for the DoD to obtain or to issue or to approve a financial authority, the acquisition plan has to be approved. But in the case of the STPs, there was no financial authority. In normal programs, the program would not continue if the DoD has not sufficient money on the budget to actually execute the program. We entered into the STPs with no money on DoD budget. And the whole financing of the programs was the subject of negotiations with various bodies which would provide financing. So there was not a case of being special defense account money on budget which could then be appropriated to Omsko by means of a financial authority.